Great. Shall we get started? Because I know that we've got a packed agenda and we all need to get away for our next meetings at 12:30. Welcome everyone to the youth vaping, young people and vaping webinar focused on education and youth organisations. We've got a really great lineup of expert speakers, and we've got around half an hour afterwards for some discussion. The slides will be sent round afterwards. I'm Kirsten Waters. I'm Director of Health and Wellbeing at Camden Council, and I'm also the lead for children and young people for the Association of Directors of Public Health. And I'm just going to hand over to Tracy Parr now, who will just briefly take us through some of the legislation that's being proposed, and then we'll move on to Professor Anne McNeill, who is Professor of Tobacco Addiction at King's College London, who's going to set the scene talking about the patterns, prevalence and harm of vaping. So over to Tracy first.
Thank you, Kirsten. And I'm not going to dwell very long on this slide, if we could move on to that slide, but just really to talk about the proposed legislation that has been announced by the government, which is around raising the age of sale and other measures on which there's a consultation at the moment. There are links in the paper. I'm sure most of you are aware of this, but just really raising the age of sale is a key factor in this legislation as part of the consultation. There are 27 other questions in the consultation, and there is support for to complete that, and we will be sending some links and popping some links in the chat. And just to reiterate that there is also an additional 70 million. We're actually getting over 9 million in London to support local stop smoking services. There's 5 million for awareness campaigns this year, and then 15 million in future years. There's the swap to stop and financial incentives for pregnant women. And then the consultation, which is more relevant to this webinar, is really on measures to reduce marketing of vapes to young people. It is illegal to sell vapes to under 18s, but we all know that there are lots available to this generation. There's also lots more money for trading standards to try and strengthen how vapes get into the market and how illegal vapes can be taken off the market. So that was just a really quick whiz through, but it's just really to give context that this is a hot issue that is on lots of people's minds, and so we would encourage you to respond to the consultation and make your views known. So I'm going to hand back to you now, Kirsten.
Thank you very much. And when we send the slides round after today's webinar, you'll get that slides with those links in, and we encourage everyone to respond to the consultation. We're going to move on to Professor Anne McNeill now, who's going to be talking about pattern, prevalence and harms of young people's vaping. Thanks, Anne.
Thanks, Kirsten. So good morning, everybody. So there are going to be two parts to this presentation. First, I'm looking at the patterns and prevalence of young people's vaping, and then secondly, the harms. Next slide, please. And in doing so, I'm going to be drawing on 6 evidence updates that we've done for the government since 2015. You can see each one has a different focus. But in each year, we've been tracking youth vaping as well as smoking patterns. And the last report was on health risks in particular. Next slide, please. OK, so now moving to prevalence and patterns, the first part of the talk. Next slide, please. So you can see in this slide, we're drawing on data from the government surveys of smoking, drinking and drug use among 11 to 15-year-olds. And the blue line is current smoking, which, as you can see, has been coming down, particularly since the turn of the century, when a comprehensive tobacco control strategy was introduced. The red line is vaping, current vaping, and since that was first measured in 2014, you can see it's been going steadily up. Next slide, please. Now, we also draw on the ASH surveys. You'll have seen that the last survey finished 2021. ASH surveys are done every year, and the data are released quickly. So here you can see the black line, again, is current smoking, and the orange line is current vaping. Now, you can see there's something funny going on in 2021, and that's because the surveys are done early in the year, and that was during a COVID lockdown of sorts. So if we ignore that, you can see generally smoking has been coming down, bobbling around a bit, and generally vaping going up, particularly from 2021 to 2022, and then sort of a little increase again in 2023. Next slide, please. What we do see, though, is a rise in experimentation. So this is showing those young people, 11 to 17-year-olds. So again, all these people, it's illegal to be sold e-cigarettes, and the same way it's illegal to be sold tobacco cigarettes. And as you can see, a big increase in experimentation there between 2022 and 2023. Next slide, please. We've also seen penetration among never smokers. So you can see, since we've been tracking this, again, using ASH data here, you can see that it's been bobbling around. And then in the last couple of years, we've seen that we are seeing current vaping among people who have never smoked cigarettes. Now, however, keep an eye on the scale. It is only 2.3% of never smokers, so it's remaining relatively rare, but this is of concern. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the orange bars here are people who've never smoked, those to whom I was just referring to. And these are the reasons they say they have tried vaping. And you can see here that the main reason among people who've never smoked is just to give it a try. Whereas for the black bars, which are people who've smoked, you see a much bigger range of reasons, including that they're using them to try to quit smoking or using them instead of smoking, which is a good thing. Next slide, please. So what we think has happened here is that this increase in vaping among young people is associated with an increase in the marketing of these new types of disposables called puff bars in general. And you can see these pictures here, you'll all be familiar with them, brightly coloured, rather jazzy looking products. And they represent the blue bars, so the disposable electronic cigarettes. And you can see a massive rise between 2021 and 2023. And the other types of e-cigarette devices going down. And you can also see here that the brightly coloured patterns have also now been expanded to the other types of e-cigarettes on the market. Next slide, please. And then just a final survey we've drawn on in our research is something called the ITC. It's an international tobacco and vaping survey, and this is done of 16 to 19-year-olds. In fact, this has just been published, so I'll update this when the slides go out. This also found an increase in vaping, but more worryingly, it saw an increase in smoking. So this is something we need to watch because obviously any increases in smoking are of real concern. Thank you. Next slide, please. Okay, now moving to the harms of young people vaping. Next slide. So as I said, we're drawing on this report. Now, in this report, we've looked at biomarkers, and these are things in the body, essentially. So they're objective markers of harm. Other studies have looked at self-reported symptoms, and we have found studies showing some respiratory symptoms, such as cough, and there is the potential to exacerbate asthma in people who have asthma. But our studies focused on these objective biomarkers, and there were only very few. I think there were 6 studies of youth that we included, but there weren't differences between youth and adults. So I'm drawing on the whole of the literature in my next few slides. Next slide, please. We looked at 2 types of biomarker, and I'm only going to focus on the biomarkers of exposure here, because the biomarkers of potential harm were a bit more mixed. So biomarkers of exposure are basically substances going around the body, and we can measure these substances in different bodily fluids or in the hair. And we've drawn on this World Health Organization list of biomarkers, as you can see from the bottom there. And I'm just going to focus first on nicotine. So next slide, please. So nicotine is the reason why people smoke, but it's not what kills them. That comes from all the other constituents that come along in cigarette smoke. Now, not all vapes contain nicotine, but they commonly do. And what we find is that nicotine is a factor in continued use. Nicotine exposure initially when people start vaping is lower than that with smoking, but over time it becomes very similar to people who smoke. Studies have found that dependence on vaping is lower than dependence on smoking, but this was before the newer products came on the market, and we certainly are hearing reports of young people being dependent, and this was picked up in the ITC study, and I'm sure you also have reports of that. Thank you. Next slide, please. So moving on to the other biomarkers of exposure, and these are associated with diseases like cancer, lung problems, and heart disease, which are the big killers from cigarette smoking. And when we compare these biomarkers between people who vape and people who smoke, we find the toxicant levels are significantly lower among people who vape than compared with people who smoke, so that's a good thing. But when you compare people vaping versus people who don't use, they're either the same, which is good, or they're higher compared with people who do neither. So our overall conclusions, next slide please, from the report was that vaping poses only a small fraction of the risks of smoking in the short to medium term. There aren't the very long-term studies, but this doesn't mean that vaping is risk-free, particularly for people who have never smoked. So the implications were that vaping can be used as an alternative to smoking to reduce the health harms of smoking, but that never or long-term former smokers, and of course young people, should be discouraged from taking up vaping unless they were going to smoke instead. However, as the next slide shows, we're seeing widespread and growing misperceptions of the relative risks of doing vaping and smoking. So the next slide, which is, thank you, of young people again, 11 to 17-year-olds. And the correct answer is the orange line, which is that vaping is less harmful than smoking. And as you can see, that's been coming down. And for the first time, actually, young people are saying they're about the same or more harmful than tobacco cigarettes. So what this means is that young people aren't taking up vaping because they think they're safe. In fact, it's associated with misperceptions growing. So there are other things here, and we think in particular the marketing and accessibility of these vapes is important. Next slide, please. I just wanted to also mention hospitalizations. You'll have seen reports of admissions for under 20-year-olds for vaping-related disorder, and this doesn't mean it's causal, but it seems to be associated with vaping. This is obviously of concern, but again, we need to put this in the perspective of, in the context of passive smoke exposure, which is causing around 5,000 child admissions every year. And then my final main slide is just to go back to the 11 to 15-year-old data. The top set of bars is it's okay to see what it's like, and the last set of bars is it's okay to use weekly. And you can see cigarettes there is the bottom of those two bars. However, you can also see alcohol picturing there concerningly, and then these other drugs. And we need to be very careful when we are talking appropriately to discourage young people from vaping, that we don't encourage them to use some more harmful products. So I think the next slide is my conclusions, which is vaping's been increasing. We've seen a 50% rise in experimentation and starting to see penetration among never smokers. And it seems to be associated with these new brightly coloured and attractive vapes. There are reports of young people being dependent on vaping, and inhaling vapes on a regular and sustained basis over time, particularly if starting from a young age, is likely to have harmful effects. So thanks to my colleagues, and happy to answer any questions later. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Anne. That's really interesting and useful scene setting. And we're moving on now to Shelby Davis for Partnership for Young London, who's going to talk us through young people's lived experience. So welcome, Shelby, and thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to talk about a group of 14 to 25-year-olds who all identified as non-vapers that we brought together to speak about their perspectives on vaping. I'm going to touch on 3 key themes today, which is education, peers, and marketing and accessibility. The first theme that I'm going to touch on is education and the experience of schooling with vaping and how the curriculum deals with vaping. The first part of this is the lack of knowledge for students around the effects of vaping and organisations to support this. Something that our young people brought to our attention was the lack of content on vaping at school, and that schools only care about it during school hours. Some of the comments around this were, I've only ever had one actual assembly on vaping, but they only spoke about the effects of nicotine addiction. And someone added to this, my school was saying don't vape at school, do it at the park. Another point that came up around education was the lack of resources in school to support people. One of our young people said, I think it's a huge problem. I do not think there are enough resources to explain the harms it does to your body. And this further came on to us asking about the resources that our young people could name. Not one of our young people could name a single service that would support them with vaping or addiction. Some of the comments around this was, I don't know any place to help teenagers battling addiction, no matter what it is. I have no idea as a young person. I don't know what support is out there, and I don't know where to go. The second part of our education that came up was our young people spoke about the experience they are having at school being affected by vaping. Something that came up was the access to spaces for vapers and non-vapers. One of our young people that goes to college said, I have a whole group of friends that vape. They're vaping in vaping sections at college, but I don't want to be there, but I don't want to lose my friends either. This led to comments around secondary vaping and the effects it has on asthma and how to deal with not wanting to be in these spaces. Something else that came up was that toilets are a big issue for young people. Some of our young people said, I feel uncomfortable going into the toilet. I do not want to be associated with vaping through guilt. Bathrooms are a nightmare now. I'll try this vape, try this new flavour. You can't get past it. One of our young people said it's a lucky draw if you can breathe in there. The last comment on toilets was that toilets are hot boxes of vaping. Another theme that came up was peers and how it affects their self-image and popularity at school. One of our young people said, if you're not at the top of the hierarchy of school, you probably vape. Followed on from this, our young people carried on by saying lots of people who are anti-vapers get mocked and laughed at school. Some of our young people brought to our attention the idea of sharing vapes. A lot of our young people said lots of people share vapes, try new flavors, have a puff, and this affects bathrooms and outside spaces as well. And another thing on peers was the selling part. A lot of our young people said there's a hierarchy of younger people to older people either selling or having peer pressure of trying to get young people to vape. We also asked the young people if they would talk to their peers about vaping/stopping vaping. We got very negative responses to this as they did not feel that peer-to-peer conversations would help young people with educating of vaping or trying to stop. Our young people said that vaping is the new norm. I know a lot of people in secondary school, if you're not at the top, you don't have much to say in the decisions or opinions of young peers. People are so set in their ways about vaping, they don't want to be convinced to change their mind. Next slide, please. And the final theme we came across was the accessibility and the marketing of vapings. Something that came up was the profit of vaping and the business avenue for students. Someone said older years used to sell weed to year 9s and now it's vapes. People from the corner shops keep approaching me to sell vapes. It's not just selling, but also people are sharing vapes between friends. People are so addicted they're sharing flavors between each other. Another issue that came up was around corner shops. Our young people said that corner shops are a major challenge. They're more interested in the money, not the health issues. They don't check IDs. One of our young people said, I went test purchasing with my council. None of the big shops sold to us, but the small ones did. And someone said corner shops just don't seem to care. Another part that came up was marketing through the colouring, flavouring, and the advertising, such as sweets. One of our young people said that vapes are advertised like sweets. Vapes are like the new fruit pastels. Sweets have loads of colouring, and it replicates that even through the sweet flavours. One of our young people said about the colours that vape adverts are not serious. They're colourful and not seen as a problem. Packaging on vapes does not prevent people from vaping, it actually attracts them. And one of our young people said that vaping is seen as a joke. One of our young people said that they've heard people saying, I'm addicted to flavoured air. And one of our young people said that advertising doesn't really make a difference. No one actually cares if there's nicotine. They go for the taste and flavours. They will use whichever ones they can get their hands on. The final thing I want to bring up that we finished our conversation asking the young people what they wanted policymakers to hear around vaping. The first thing around this was resources. Our young people said, as a young person, I do not know any places to help battle teenage addiction. We just want more information and to know what support is out there. And the second thing they wanted policymakers to hear was that they need safe spaces. We need to prepare young people with a safe space to talk about their ideas and thoughts without feeling judgment. Thank you for listening.
Thanks very much, Shabby. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions on some of that really interesting information when we come to our Q&A. We're just going to move on now to Sarah Hepworth, who is a school health improvement principal and public health at Sheffield City Council, and she's going to be talking us through some resources that are available for schools. So welcome, Sarah. Oh, sorry, Sarah, you're just on mute. Brilliant,
Oh dear. Hi, yes, so I'm Sarah Hepworth, Health Improvement Principal, and I'm the Tobacco Control Lead for Sheffield at Sheffield City Council. So I'm going to talk to you today about the vaping resources for youth that we developed alongside ASH that were launched in February of this year. Next slide, please. I just want to start by saying what we do in Sheffield in terms of tobacco control and comprehensive tobacco control, and kind of framing why Sheffield, why were we the ones to develop these resources. We deliver comprehensive tobacco control in Sheffield. Now, you can't really see all of that, but in line with the World Health Empower model, and we deliver a range of comms and marketing campaigns, and we deliver 4 a year. And it was on my radar. We knew that it was an issue in terms of vaping to develop a vaping campaign for children and young people and communications campaign. I didn't want to do this just in Sheffield. We know it's a really tricky issue, and I felt that it was something that we shouldn't do alone. We didn't want to lead into unintended consequences, and we also wanted to make sure that we'd got a range of partners helping us in developing this. So I approached OHID and ASH, who thankfully were available to work with us on this and really keen to work with us on this. Next slide, please. This is just a range of the comms and marketing that we've done in Sheffield, just to give you an overview. You can look at some of those videos after this presentation. Next slide, please. So in terms of the local context, I first became aware of Elfin Geek Bars, which I had to Google in June of 2022. And this is because we'd had an admission, a child had nosebleeds, and this was the first that came to my attention. I then took the new Sheffield Tobacco Control Strategy to the Sheffield Youth Council, and not one of the 17 children who were aged 11 to 17 wanted to talk to me about smoking, which I'm sure many of you have a similar scenario with. They were all concerned about vaping, about their peers, and they wanted to get across their individual questions, and that was the first alarm bell for me around misinformation and how much we needed to do what work was ahead. We had increasing calls from school, as I know were happening across the country, safeguarding leads, teachers who were really concerned and also wanting correct information and resources. Alongside that, I saw an increase in reported sales through to trading standards of illegal sales and underage sales. And we had a 60% failure rate on going out and doing the test purchases and underage sales. Misinformation was rife at the time. If you Googled vaping and young people, you got the US position, which was problematic because we're very different to the US in terms of legislation and also advice, and our position per se. Doing nothing was a risk. I'd got people creating their own resources in Sheffield. We knew this was happening also across the country. Inaccurate and inconsistent information would lead to further harm. And certainly in terms of adults, we've got concerns around that we may see people going back to smoking because they felt that vaping wasn't a safe option for them, or a safer option. Next slide, please. ASH developed and launched their resource for schools in September 2020, and this was excellent. It's very, very detailed, as I'm sure you're all aware, but I felt that schools would need a range of resources, and this was where we started to look at the toolkit for schools. So we worked with ASH and OHID, as I've mentioned, Sheffield Youth Council, Bristol University, Sheffield University, and this was looking at taking a behavioural science approach and avoiding those unintended consequences. We worked with safeguarding leads, parents and children and young people. Next slide, please. So the aim of the campaign is to raise awareness of the facts and potential risks arising from vaping when taken up by children and young people, as well as myth-bust. The resources were developed in collaboration with ASH, as I've mentioned, to support conversations, evidence-based conversations to enable children and young people to make informed decisions about smoking and vaping. And it was really important also that we had that thread throughout in terms of where we're coming from here. It's the counterfactual and talking about the risks of vaping in comparison to smoking. The campaign doesn't replace the need for targeted action to prevent underage sales of vapes and further restrictions on advertising and increased regulation. We know that they're going to be the most effective in reducing prevalence of youth vaping. Next slide, please. So what did we develop? A range of things. So posters on vaping for children and young people. These were to be used within toilets. We were told that was one of the most common areas, as we just heard as well, where children and young people were vaping. We developed an animation that's just only 1:30, but it covers a range of the key messages to allow these to be used in assemblies, also within classrooms in form time for discussion and debate. And then we developed 2 presentations, one that was for the teachers to use in the classroom that was very user friendly in terms of children and young people, and to keep their focus and attention, and one that was more detailed for teachers so that they could be discussion ready and be equipped with more information. We then also developed a parents leaflet which discussed the main key facts, but also has information on how to start a discussion with children and young people and what to do if your child or young person is vaping. We sent this information out through newsletters, through schools. I think it's really important. I'm sure many of you are using these resources and the ASH resources, but ensuring that you send them on a regular basis to schools has been critical. They can be accessed through the Smoke Free Sheffield website or the ASH website, and here are the links that you can access if you've not seen them already. Next slide, please. So we also drafted a letter for schools to inform head teachers what we were doing and why in terms of the toolkit and what was involved in that, and some ideas of where they might utilise them across the curriculum in the school. This is the teacher's vaping presentation. Next slide, please. So this is just giving you the 2 vaping posters which are on the bottom, the parents leaflet, and then the video, which again can be accessed via YouTube or either of those links. Next slide, please. In terms of the key messages, it was really important to get across that most children and young people don't vape or smoke. So whilst we have seen an increase, and that is concerning for all of us, we have got a situation where it feels like, if you speak to people, they say absolutely everybody's doing it. That isn't the case. We've got a worrying trend, but it was important to get that across. And also to get across the fact that nicotine vapes are really helpful for adult smokers. We know that children are going home to parents and grandparents that might be using vapes to support them to move away from tobacco. We wanted to get across clear messaging around the harms of vaping compared to smoking, which you can see here as well, and really reiterate around the short-term and long-term effects and the fact that they are unknown. We also got across the fact around vapes being an age-restricted product, but really went down the line of don't be duped, because that was something that the young people felt strongly about, and also the environmental impact, and taking this strapline of don't smoke, don't start to vape. So that was how we framed all of the messaging that was targeted towards children and young people. Next slide, please. I won't read through all of these topics, but it's just to give you the breadth of what's covered in the teacher's presentation. We all know it's a really complex, tricky issue, and we wanted to make sure that teachers were fully equipped. So it is a comprehensive toolkit that dispels the myths across a range of areas and provides evidence-based information. Next slide, please. So in terms of the message development, I mentioned, so I commissioned a company called Diva Creative who delivered the comms and marketing campaigns for Smoke Free Sheffield. And they developed factually accurate information that was going to resonate with teenage audience. We worked to compile those messages looking through the evidence base and research from, you've heard from Anne earlier, from Anne's OHID reports, from Cochrane reviews. We looked at the ASH data that was already prepared for schools, Frank, and the New Zealand model, which was really, really helpful. New Zealand had gone further, and obviously the ASH surveys. We had many iterations. It took 8 months for us to develop the resources that you now see available. And I worked really closely with Deborah and OHID colleagues and Yorkshire and Humber subgroup to develop them and take several comments and make sure that we were getting the language right and that it was going to resonate. We agreed the messaging and we tested it locally with Sheffield Youth Council, and we had to be really careful with this because normally what you would do is you go back and you'd ask the students in terms of commenting, and some of it we couldn't ask the students about. So just to be clear, they wanted us to say smoking and vaping is as bad as each other. They wanted us to tell them that vaping was terrible and that they were going to see the same health effects as smoking. So that was something that we couldn't test on. But what we did test on was how does the key messages that we've developed resonate? Are they clear? Do you understand what we're trying to say? And that comes again into some of the myths that we've heard earlier as well. So we've worked with 71 children and young people. to review the revised final messaging that we came to. We also worked across with Yorkshire and Humber colleagues, Learn Sheffield and Fresh, which I'm sure many of you know, Safeguarding Leeds and other tobacco leads. Next slide, please. So this is the range of councils, just to give you the overview, and different partners that were involved. Next slide, please. In terms of the young people's feedback, it was overwhelming. The majority told us that the responses were clear and they understood what the posters were trying to say. Regarding the colours and graphical style, they said that they were good, they were eye-catching, and they drew them in. A few commented that they were boring, and you obviously do get quite a diverse range of views. And some people liked all of the information, but others wanted less. Some people wanted them to be more fun. Some wanted more stats, and some said that they were easy to read, and some said that they were difficult to read. But overall, the general consensus was that they were clear, and the message was really clear coming across, and they were eye-catching. Okay, next slide, please. In terms of understanding the message, these were the things that when we asked for their top 3 responses, people said that what came out to them, the young people, and it was that they understood about the environmental impact, that vapes are a quick aid for adults, that they're not risk-free. They were the top ones, and then all of these others were also listed. So it was overall really positive that we were resonating in the way that we wanted to with our key messages. Next slide, please. When asked what they would do in response to seeing the posters, we had a range of responses from I'd stop smoking or I'd stop vaping, I'd try and change my mate's mind, stop them smoking, I'd tell a friend. Again, it was overwhelmingly positive that they would take action in a variety of ways. So that was, again, really helpful to see. Next slide, please. So we've had interest. So as of last night, it was 70 local authorities. Diva have just told me this morning it's 89 local authorities, and 70 local authorities are actually using the resources across the country. So that you've got the range of different places that I've listed there, and the whole of Guernsey are actually using them. So we're really pleased to see that they're helping people far and wide as we're all grappling with these issues. And we've got over 5,000 views on YouTube. Just in terms of my next 2 slides cover next steps. So locally, we're encouraging head teachers, safeguarding leads to respond to the consultation, as I know we all are nationally. We know that that's going to be really critical, and to draft letters to their local MPs. We're developing youth videos to get the youth voice out there in terms of the consultation. We're working with schools to understand how resources are being used and address barriers. One school I went into to talk to them, they couldn't get past the firewall to play the video. That was really distressing to me. I was like, well, all the things, but it's sometimes really making sure that implementation is possible. We've got an 18-month programme with Sheffield College and Sheffield University, really working on a strategic level, looking at smoke-free campuses, as well as including youth vaping. And the final slide. We're considering additional resources around illicit vapes. We know that there's particular issues in that way that we need to convey. Again, it's a really tricky space, and we need to be careful about what we're putting out there, but making sure we do alert people to the fact that we're not aware what's in illicit vapes and we don't know the long-term impact. And the nicotine content, as we all know, is significantly higher. Evaluation, we're looking at this with Sheffield University and partners across Yorkshire and Humber to look at the impact of these specific resources. Thanks very much.
Fantastic. Thanks, Sarah. That's a really comprehensive overview. And we're handing over now to Asha Fowles, who is Head of Education and Engagement at the Daniel Marbo Spags Foundation, which was the foundation established in 2014 by Tim and Fiona Spargo-Mabs in response to the tragic death of their 16-year-old son who died after taking ecstasy, and it supports safer choices around drugs and alcohol, and also harm reduction. So welcome, Asha.
Thank you very much. I'm aware there's quite a lot of animation on my slides, so whoever is sharing them, Claire, I think, do feel free to just kind of make everything appear on each slide. So if you could move on to the next slide. So just to kind of add to that, our provision is universal drugs education. We go into nearly 700 schools and colleges now, mostly in London and the South East, but we do go nationally and even internationally as well. If you could move on to the next slide. And if you can let all of it come through, thank you. So before we go into schools, when we're talking to slightly older students, so usually year 11 and upwards, we'll ask them to complete a survey, and it means that we can really tailor what we're talking about to fit them. But one of the questions we ask is this: which are the main substances people in your year group use, if they do? And this is about perceptions as opposed to confessions, but 96% said vaping. And over the last few years, we've really seen this rise, and it's now overtaken alcohol. And you can see some kind of comparative figures there. Another question that we ask, which is which substances do you think cause people in your year group the most problems? And vaping comes out top. I've said on this slide that it's nearly 1,500 students who've completed it since the beginning of this academic year. I looked yesterday because I did this slide deck on Friday and it had actually gone up to over 1,600. We are quite busy. Next slide, please. So I thought what might be useful to kind of lay out was how we approach this when we're going into schools. Sometimes we will include vaping as part of a kind of broader provision that goes through a whole load of stuff around alcohol and general risks, as well as some specific risks as well. But we have been asked to do some very specific workshops just on vaping. And the way that we feel is very impactful is to ask a series of questions, and it means that we can get it a bit more discussion based, even if we've got kind of a whole year group or more. So there's various questions. This is the third question that we ask, and it's around how much nicotine they consider is in a disposable vape. And we ask for a show of hands around these different answers. Next slide, please. By getting to think about these questions, it means that we can put in some what we would regard as underpinning knowledge. And everything that we do at the foundation is evidence-based, and that is really important because we are trying to empower and enable young people to make safer choices that are based around stats and facts and clinical data and that kind of thing. So by laying out the answer to this question, which is that actually vapes can contain a huge kind of equivalent number of cigarettes, it's one of those things that they may well not have thought about. And then we can tie that back into kind of nicotine and how addictive it is. We do also touch on illicit vapes. When we are doing a specific workshop on vaping, it tends to be younger year groups, and there will be a fair number of them engaging in vaping or thinking about it, and so they know full well that when they're buying things, it's at the corner shops, things that are probably not legal, and so just highlighting that all bets are off if they're buying those products in terms of nicotine content, as well as all of those other things that are in there, it can really land with them. Next slide, please. So another question that we ask is around environmental impact. And again, we'll ask for a show of hands around the number that they think are thrown away each week. Next slide, please. And just laying this out, there are lots and lots of different ways into information for young people. And as I say, you just don't know what's going to land with them. But I remember when I was at a school recently talking about this, when I said it was 5 million were thrown away each week and showed them the headline that really backed that up, there was an audible gasp, and they just hadn't thought about it. And just highlighting what that impact is. You know, they're not allowed to have single-use straws, but they are all of these vapes, and they will have been seeing them kind of just chucked away on the pavement. That can really have an impact on them. But also looking at all of those kind of other things that are in them, particularly with the younger students, we find that the environmental messages do often really kind of resonate with them. Next slide, please. A lot of our work is around social norms and reinforcing those. And so this is another question that we will ask. And again, we'll ask for a show of hands. And next slide, please. And then when we reveal the actual answer, and again, we will always talk about what the evidence for that is, it really can have an impact on them. And again, this is one of those audible gasp moments. And it's just about reinforcing the fact that even though they may perceive that lots and lots of people are doing something, that may well not be the case. And just having some understanding of that and reinforcing to them that they really do need to question where these beliefs come from, that can really make a difference to them. Next slide, please. Another thing that we seem to have lost a couple of slides. Another thing that we ask is why people vape, and why are the reasons that they might not. And in terms of the answers that we get to those, we will then explore things like the presence on social media, kind of how the products are marketed, the different flavours, the different colours. Okay, here we go. They seem to have come up in the wrong order. Sorry about that. So if you can move on to the next slide, it just means that we can just really get them to kind of really think about some of the messages that they're receiving. And we do draw this kind of comparison with smoking adverts as well. Also, where are they seeing adverts? What are the messages that they're giving? Are they seeing them on social media? And why do, when we see some messaging from people that we would consider experts, such as the chief medical officer, why does that feel that it outweighs some of the other messaging that they receive? And then they will soon realise that that is a one-off news headline, but they're seeing them in their socials all the time, and realising that that is no accident, that is something that's happening deliberately, because if they are seeing something in front of them a lot, it normalises it for them, and that means that they're much more likely to engage in it. That does really give them a cause to kind of just pause for a moment and just think a little bit more about the choices that they're making. I don't know if they've gone out of sync, but it would be useful to go back to the for more information and support slide, whether that's next or whether it's somewhere gone back, I don't know. Now, we don't just work with young people, we also have significant amount of provision around parents and caregivers, and we also run training for school and college staff as well. And obviously the sources that we will be flagging up to them will be different. So for young people, some of the places that we will talk about are things like Frank, so they can get some information. Also Young Minds, because the motivation behind the decisions that some of them are making, it can be things like coping strategies. And so understanding that there are better ways to try and manage those situations. We also do flag up the US Smoke Free site, because there's quite a lot of information on there about teenage vaping, but also some really useful kind of information about encouraging young people to stop vaping and cut back, because that does need to be tackled in a slightly different way. For parents and caregivers, we've developed various resources for them. There is a dedicated landing page for that. We have video resource, and we also have what we call a quick guide, which is kind of written information that they can access. And for school and college staff, we've actually developed, due to overwhelming demand, a vaping resource pack. And that is for schools to deliver themselves. We provide a PowerPoint, but also a lesson plan. Again, it has all that underpinning information in there, and it's differentiated for different year groups. That was our most downloaded PSHE resource last year. So this feels like it's something that is really big in schools. It is a really top source of concern for them, and so it's really important that they do have the resources that they need to be able to tackle it. And when we're talking to parents about it as well, and caregivers, we're also reinforcing those very same messages. Thank you very much.
Fantastic, thanks so much, Asha. And now we're moving on again to Dr. Jasmine Kuja, who is a Senior Research Associate at the Alcohol and Tobacco Group at the University of Bristol, and she's going to be talking about effective messaging around youth vaping. So welcome, Jasmine.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. So if you go on to the first slide, or the next one. Sorry, just the next slide as well. Thank you. So today I'm just going to be talking to you about some work that we've been doing around the messaging of vaping to young people. And there's a lot of similarities between what I'm saying and what has already been said today. So apologies if anything is kind of reiterating, but I think it's important to know that this is coming from a range of different sources as well. So the reason that I've been doing this work is that we were approached by Bristol City Council, and they were concerned about the anecdotal reports that they were having from schools saying vaping is an increasing issue, and it is something that they were struggling to deal with. So the first thing that we did in response to Bristol City Council was to say, well, let's see how much of an issue this is in the southwest of England. So we have done a survey to kind of gauge those responses from young people in the southwest. And then we also thought about how we can actually help to solve this issue as well. And as well as using some of the resources that have already been talked about, we've done our own workshops and about to do some interviews to help us to try and develop an intervention or improve on the interventions that are actually existing at the moment. Next slide, please. So in the survey, we aimed to recruit 200 people, but we actually got 196 after we did some quality checks. And sorry, the slides have got a bit awry, so I'm hoping the others aren't. So we asked young people who are around 11 to 17 years old, who are attending a secondary school or college within the southwest of England, to complete the survey. Next slide. And then in our workshop, we had a 2-hour session in which we asked young people, eventually we had 10 young people aged 11 to 16 living in the southwest of England, and we asked them to help us try and design an intervention and to tell us a bit about vaping. And the objectives here were to generate ideas for an intervention and that we could then use to design an intervention prototype that we could then test. But importantly, although we tried to get young people who had vaped before into these workshops, we actually mostly had people that had never vaped turn up, even though people said they were going to. Next slide. So just to give you a bit of an idea of who we were talking to in the survey here. So around 25%, around a quarter, used disposable vapes or ever. So this is just once or twice. And most of the people that responded hadn't used any product that we asked them about. So hadn't used rechargeable vapes, tobacco, nicotine pouches, shisha or disposables. But we did see that 15% had used rechargeable vapes and 15% had used tobacco. And there was quite a lot of overlap between these three groups as well. And for the keen eyes among you, you will notice that the numbers don't quite add up here in terms of the percentages. And that's because there were a couple of young people that said they'd used none of the above and also said they'd used a product. So there was a little bit of confusion there in the survey. And next, there's just an extra thing to pop up. Yep. So I just wanted to mention as well that when we asked those disposable vape users how often they used e-cigarettes, most of them did say that they hadn't used it in the past 30 days, but we had around 17% say that they were using it every day. And we also asked them where they were using it as well. And there was pretty consistent patterns. It looked like the same people that were using them every day were using them in school, they were using them at home, and they were using them outside of the school and home, which does suggest that they're using them fairly frequently as well. And the next slide, please. And it's important when we're thinking about messaging to young people to know what is actually important to them, what is driving them to do these, to vape, essentially. And we found that the majority of them said that they vaped because they liked the flavours and because it tasted good and because they liked the social side of vaping. And some of them said that they did it to perform tricks, and some did it to relax or relieve tension. And a lot, again, similarly said that they did it to fit in or because their friends do it. So if we go to the next slide. And they did indeed say that a lot of their friends were vaping as well. So sorry, this is a little bit small, but here we can see that in the darker orange here, that's the people that said some of their friends vaped. And in the grey, 52% there said most of their friends vaped. So there's quite a large majority of people who vape had friends that also vape. Next slide. And among those that didn't vape, we did see that they were seeing it a lot. So here we can see that in the blue and the dark orange, we see more than half of the people responded that they'd seen someone vaping at school using a disposable once a week or more. And next slide, please. So what we also did was ask about their thoughts on how we could discourage vaping in schools and generally. And these are just some of the things they came up with in the survey. So they said disposable vapes should be made illegal. They said schools and colleges should confiscate disposable vapes and that they should sanction people who use them. And they also said that students need to be more educated on the negative health consequences of vaping. And those top three, I will say we did have a majority of people responding to this survey who had never vaped before. So I thought maybe there might be a difference in those that had and hadn't, and then looked through the survey responses. And actually, some of the people who had vaped before were still making these suggestions as well. And then the last point here, that students need to be more educated on negative health consequences of vaping. That's something that we're seeing from the talks you've had earlier, but it's something that we wanted to focus on moving forward. So next slide, please. Yep, sorry, I think slides are out of sync. That's fine, thank you. So this came from the workshop now. So we asked in the workshop, what do you think makes people like you want to vape? And we asked this because it's important when we're delivering messaging to understand what's driving them again. So these are the key themes that came out. Peer pressure, friends vaping or saying it's good, thinking it's trendy, current, or seeing celebs and influencers using them, Curiosity and appeal of flavours was something that came through as well, but they also talked about lack of ID checks and the adverts that they were seeing near their schools for vapes. Again, they said there was not enough education at school, and they did say that they thought some people were vaping instead of smoking, and they thought that some people were vaping because they were already addicted to nicotine, and some were vaping because of their mental health as well, so doing it to relax or feel better. And next slide. And we also asked them what they think stops people like them from vaping, or would have stopped you if they had vaped. And it being illegal was something that was driving them not to vape. There was also a real influence from parents, family, but also in terms of religion as well, being an important factor for people not vaping. We also talked about health and addiction as a reason, and they were also very aware about the environment and the impact on the environment, and that was a good reason for them to not vape. And their friends, their situation in social settings seemed really important. So having a lack of pressure was really a big driving factor for them to be able to not vape. And then they also thought that the news, the stories that they were seeing were quite scary, and that they didn't want to be involved with vaping because of that. And then next slide. And then we asked them about their ideas to intervene, and we got some quite interesting responses. So the two main things that came out in terms of how we should intervene was to promote on social media good advice about vaping, and they specifically suggested Dr. Phil and also Dr. Mike as well, who, if you don't know them, are social media influencers, but they are health professionals as well. And they thought it would be great to hear something from someone like them via their social media about vaping. And they also said they wanted more information in class and at school. And probably not surprisingly, they said that they don't want it to be preachy or patronizing. And I think anyone who's been involved with any kind of drugs advice in schools knows that that's a given. And they wanted more information specifically on the health effects. But also an interesting one was about money saving for those people that were already vaping, how much money they could save by not vaping. And a really big thing that we took away from this was that they really understood that there was no one size fits all solution. And it actually needs to be a multifaceted approach that comes from a range of different sources. So everything that we're doing here is great, but they also want it to come from other people, other areas, other social media things as well. And the next slide. So just to finish up, the takeaways from this is that young people do want more information about the health risks of vaping. We've got a lot of resources that are really good here, and they're not making it to all of the young people that want them. They want it to be multifaceted from a range of sources, so we need to work on different things, so not just things that they can be delivered in schools. And we also need to make sure that the right messages are getting to the right people. So we've mentioned already that vaping is a good way to stop smoking, and we need to be really clear about the comparisons to smoking and making sure that they're still aware that adults can use vapes to stop smoking as well. So I'm going to end there. I think I've got one last slide. It's just my contact details.
Great, thank you so much. It's reassuring that there's quite consensus in the research around some of the messaging. So thanks very much, Jasmine. Right, we're going to move on now to Sharon Long, who is Strategic Director for Partnership for Young London, and she's going to be giving a youth sector school governor perspective. So welcome, Sharon.
Thank you. I've only got a few points to make, and I guess my first coming, because there's been lots of information that's come up, and I've been taking loads of notes. I'm sure other people have. The first thing is there's lots of resources out there, it feels to me, and I think there's a role for all of us about thinking about where do we get those resources out to the places and spaces that young people inhabit. And there's a lot of work that I think needs to be done with schools, and I'm a school governor, but I think there's also a lot of work that needs to happen in the informal youth sector space, as well as in faith spaces, in places that young people go to. And I think there's a real job of work for us to be mapping where young people are at this moment in time with them, and thinking about how do we get these resources out there. So I think there's a job for all of us to do, to think creatively across this. And part of the reason I say that is because, yes, of course, schools are an ideal location, but for some of those young people who might not be in school or might have a difficult relationship with schools, who else is engaged with those young people, whether it's through their housing organisations, whether it's in places like McDonald's. How do we really engage across a diversity of places and spaces that young people are at to really engage with them? So I think that's one of the things that I would come into on this, but also recognising that what everybody has said so far is that there's a lot of data out there in terms of the evidence, a lot of feedback from young people in terms of what they think needs to happen. And there's also a lot of resources. So it feels to me there's a job of collating that and making sure we get this out really widely. And I'm looking at it very much from a London perspective. I think there's another thing that's come up through our work is about how do we engage with a diverse range of young people about the interventions needed, because what might work, and I know Shelby was talking earlier on about the feedback from those young people, is what might work for some of those young people on that call is not going to work with another group that we're with at this moment in time. So how do we look at that? And I think you said it earlier on with that multifaceted approach, because there isn't just one opportunity here, there's multiple opportunities. So I think there's a bit of a job of work to be done about that co-design with young people in terms of the range of interventions that go on. And I was really struck by the 5 million vapes that are being disposed every week. That messaging is going to really work for young people who've got a focus on environmental issues and things like that, but it might not work for another group of young people. And so how are we looking at targeting and tailoring our messaging around some of this? I think there's something for me about the feedback that we're getting from a lot of young people is how this is part of a range of coping mechanisms in terms of stress and anxiety, mental health, and also peer pressure. And one of the things that I would urge us to think about is that when we talk about safeguarding issues with young people, we talk about contextual safeguarding. So we talk about how do we work with young people in the places and spaces they are in. And there's a lot of work around contextual safeguarding and the role of peers within this. And I think we do have to look at the role of peers in this as well, in terms of thinking about, and I'm saying this very conscious that a lot of those young people said they found it really hard to challenge their peers. And I think Shelby talked about that hierarchy of peers within a school context. But I think we also have to think about how do we work with other young people as well in terms of shaping and developing some of our ideas on this. I think one of the things that I would say is actually, what do we do for people working in informal youth sector? How do we think about training and supporting and resources for youth sector organisations so that they're really equipped to have some of those conversations? Because they've been doing it a lot already, particularly in terms of looking at young people and cannabis and things like that, and young people and alcohol. And they're all coming up with this and saying, well, what are the points that we need to be considering? What are some of the issues in terms of your health issues? But also, how don't we displace risk? So how do we talk about one thing like vaping, but don't displace the risk onto something else? So I think some work around that, I think, would be really, really helpful for people. People are really up for these conversations, and it is a massive conversation at the moment. And I think there's an opportunity for us to build on some of that. One of the things that I was just thinking about when I was hearing everybody speak is that I don't know if people have seen this, and it's a slight tangent, but McDonald's are developing up a partnership with the youth sector around detached youth work. Now, don't get me wrong, this is with BBC Children in Need. There's been lots of information coming out about BBC, particularly around McDonald's and their employment of staff. But one of the things that I really like about the model, and it's not without its challenges, is they are embedding contextual safeguarding across it. They are training their staff. They're recognising their employment practices as well. But also one of the things that we have to recognise is there are probably more young people going to McDonald's than there are to some youth sector organisations. And so we have to really think about where are young people accessing services or support, whether it's through leisure centres, youth clubs, faith organisations, high street locations. How do we engage with young people in the multiple settings that they engage with? So I think there's a bit of us all coming together and trying to put that jigsaw together. We can't do any of that without having those conversations with young people. Because as I started off by saying, is every single intervention we're going to look at is probably going to look very different for different groups of young people. And part of this is about us just recognising the complexity of the responses we need to develop. But now is a really good time to have those conversations. So I guess my final things are about sharing what we have to date. There's loads of resources. I've been taking all of those links off the chat, thinking this is really helpful for the youth sector. I think there's something about the multifaceted approach. I'm stealing somebody else's slides on that because that is absolutely critical for me. And there's something for me about, and I'm really conscious that some young people feel very anxious about being in these spaces, having these conversations, because they feel like they're going to be judged or challenged. And it's about recognizing some of the complex reasons why they might be doing it and having an open dialogue with them about that. I think there's also something about how we might want to target some of our educational resources that are happening in schools, also to make sure that the informal youth sector can access them as well, because I think everybody is dealing with this, whether it's in terms of cleaning up the streets or cleaning up the parks with the disposable vapes, but also they are dealing with it in terms of people standing outside shops or people standing outside youth clubs. Smoking and vaping is an absolutely massive issue for young people, and we need to be just thinking about what are some of our sort of developmental ways of taking this forward. I think that's all I would say at this moment in time. Slides have been really useful. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sharon. That's really valuable to hear your perspective, but also transition us really well onto our Q&A, who are also welcoming Louise Ross, who is a clinical consultant for the National Centre for Smoking Cessation and Training, who is joining the panel. So if people want to be able to put their questions into the meeting chat, then we can direct them to our panel members. And we've got one around, are there any resources for young people on how to say no to peers? And I think it was really interesting to hear Shelby's perspectives on sort of that hierarchy of peers. And I think it's really important that we are equipping young people with those skills. So I don't know who wants to answer those.
I can. We certainly have resources around peer pressure and young people. So one of the things that we do is develop PSHE resources for schools to use themselves, and they're all free to download from our website. They're differentiated by year group, and they're also broken down into either kind of PSHE lesson durations or kind of 20-minute form time durations, and peer pressure is something that's covered quite a lot in that, because also their needs are going to change as they get older and the situations that they're in, but it's really useful for schools to use those for kind of peer-to-peer learning as well, in terms of embedding that messaging. So we certainly have a lot of that, and we cover it when we're going in and delivering workshops as well.
Great, thank you. Does anyone else want to come in on that?
I suppose one important thing to remember is that it's not just about vaping. There are so many behaviours that you would want to equip young people to be resilient enough to be able to refuse, like using weeds, self-harming, getting into a car driven by somebody who hasn't got a licence, all sorts of things, and it has to be looked at in the round, doesn't it, rather than just focusing on one issue, which let's face it is actually less harmful than some of the other things that they could be doing.
Yes, thanks, Louise. Good point. Sarah, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I totally agree with what you're saying, Louise. And I think schools are really well versed in this as well in terms of peer pressure and that support. But specifically, the teacher presentation covers how to address peer support in our resources and peer pressure in terms of the discussion and facilitating that, and also the parents' leaflet. So just wanted to outline that.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Some more questions from the chat. We've got Kirsten Wilby, who said, it's interesting what you shared around McDonald's. Can you send any links to their future projects and training programs? And that would be really helpful. And also, Claire Gallagher said, are there any support or resources for young people in Scotland? And then Sharon and then Asha want to come in.
Yeah, really quickly, Kirsten, McDonald's are just working with BBC Children in Need to really push forward some examples of the youth sector linking with McDonald's. The one in London is actually where they're opening up a space within McDonald's to have youth work and detached youth work going on there. And part of the problem, and I think this is a really interesting model for all of us to think about, is that what happens is often young people in those places and spaces get dispersed. So you're just moving the problem elsewhere. And what they're looking at is how do we have youth workers based in McDonald's supporting young people and making sure they bring down any antisocial behaviour and supporting them, things like that. But they're also doing something which I think is really interesting, is they're also looking at their apprenticeship levy so they can train up more youth workers moving forward. So it's a really interesting, we can have a big debate about McDonald's food. I'm not even going into that one on this call, but actually one of the things on this is actually how do we develop up more partnerships with the private sector? Because I will say in multiple meetings, there's probably more young people in McDonald's in Brixton than there are at a youth club just down the road. So we have to think about those places and spaces. I can't access the chat weirdly, which is fine, but I can send the information about McDonald, the BBC Children in Need project with McDonald's to somebody else, and they can forward it on to you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Sharon. Asha, do you want to come in?
Yes, I was going to pick up on the question around resources for Scotland. We're actually doing quite a lot of work in Scotland. We've got a big pilot running in 3 kind of areas in the Grampian area. And the view is that then it will roll out throughout the whole kind of area next year. Because of all of the work that we're doing up there, actually all our PSHE resources are developed for Scotland as well. So there's separate resources for England and Wales and for Scotland. So the signposting is different, some of the data that we use is different, and that's kind of been a really important part around what we do. Someone's asked also about how to stop vaping for young people. We actually found the US smoke-free resources quite good for that.
Sorry, that was a question around how we can support young people who are addicted to vaping, access support. And then Tracy has also put in around hospital admission data and vaping. Many illegal vapes have extraordinarily high levels of nicotine, and do we have any indication of how and if these are linked to admission? So one around, again, any other comments around young people, supporting young people who are addicted to vaping, and then anything on hospital admissions?
I mean, I can come in on the hospital admission issue because I presented that slide. And I think the short answer is no, Tracy. We don't have a lot of information around what was associated with those hospitalizations. There certainly are high levels of nicotine in illicit, in some of the illicit vapes. That would tend, if somebody inhaled a lot of nicotine, they would be nauseous. But that is also a self-regulating issue. People tend to titrate their nicotine levels to one that they find is acceptable to them. So whilst it would have a short-term impact, it would probably be a deterrent one from them carrying on vaping at those very high levels. We have seen in one study up in the north, there were high levels of metals in a small sample of illicit vapes, which was of concern. So I'm really pleased to see the new initiatives to drive down illicit sales, because I think that will be enormously helpful, because the other products that are legally on the market are indeed notified to the MHRA. So at least we know and have information on what's in them. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And just for clarity around those young people who feel that they're addicted to vaping and want to stop vaping, can someone explain what the sort of cessation pathways and offer for young people are? Louise, I don't know if you want to come in on that one.
Yes, thank you. Sorry, just putting hand down. The NCSCT has got a guide on stopping vaping, and this is aimed at adults who have used vaping to stop smoking. So there's very much a connection there between, what they're doing now and, whatever you do, don't go back to smoking. But the same rules can be applied to anybody who wants to stop vaping. We don't feel it needs medicalising. It's about self-efficacy and being able to kind of take control of behaviour, just like with many other behaviours. Getting on with your homework and that sort of thing, needs some self-efficacy to actually achieve it. So generally, make sure that you always pause if there's any risk of going back to smoking. Titrating down in strength so that you're using a weaker and weaker nicotine liquids to vape, and putting boundaries in. So making sure that you don't have it in your pocket all the time. That it's somewhere else. You have to actually go and fetch it if you want to vape, rather than having something, like as people often describe, like a dummy that's in your mouth all the time. So applying those rules can be very effective. Great, thanks, Louise. Jasmine, do you want to come in?
Yeah, and thanks, Louise, because I've been using those resources as well, and they're very helpful. The one thing that I would add, or that I have been adding, is that we know that some people are vaping for mental health reasons, and so it's really important to understand why they are vaping, because if it is for something like that, then we need to provide them with other support, and address the reasoning why they're vaping rather than the vaping itself. We first need to sort out their mental health.
Absolutely.
Great, thank you. Yes, someone's asked that question around the links between mental health and vaping as a coping mechanism. And we've had a question, how do we compare nicotine levels in cigarette puff as opposed to vape puff? That's the question that we are being asked by young people. Anne?
Yeah, I'm happy to come in because we do get this question a lot. It is incredibly complicated, I would say, to start off with. But if you've got a vape of around 20 milligram milliliter, so at the highest level that's legal in England, that would give you nicotine, which is at the very lower end of a pack of 20 cigarettes. However, I would say it depends very much on how they're used. As I've said, people tend to titrate to a level that's comfortable for them. And so it's very hard to compare a vape to a cigarette in terms of how much nicotine would be absorbed. I just wanted to pick up on one other question about vaping in hospital for young people, and how you would manage that. And I think it's a good point. We're facing this in other situations as well, where people cannot vape. I mean, I guess for young people, nicotine replacement therapies can be used. They're licensed for use by 12-year-olds and above. So one could consider giving other nicotine replacement therapies to young people who are vaping. Thanks.
Thank you, that's really useful. Jasmine, do you want to come in as well?
Yeah, I just wanted to come in on the puffing cigarettes versus vaping thing as well, because there's quite a dangerous line you play there when you try and compare the two, not just because when we're talking about what the equivalents are, we're talking about nicotine, but actually there's so much other stuff that you're getting in with a cigarette that you can't compare the two. So I had some students come up to me at the end of an assembly the other day and they said, is it true that using a disposable vape is as bad as smoking 200 cigarettes? And then I was like, well, no. And then it's the same though. It's like, no, because this messaging has got crossover. So you do need to be very careful about talking about the equivalents if you're talking about nicotine or whatever.
Thanks, Louise. You want to come back in?
Yes, thank you. I think the other danger there, and you've touched on it, Jasmine, is using American sources of information. They're highly misleading. The Americans seem to say almost anything, to frighten young people off vaping, and adults as well, without actually looking at what is accurate and what is not. And I think that runs the risk of utterly discrediting experts who are trying to give correct information to young people. If you look at American sites when they start talking about vaping giving you brain worms, it's just so far away from the truth that it's extremely unhelpful, and it ruins our integrity. We're all lumped together.
Thanks, Louise. We've got another question. Mandy's asked around what extent that parents and carers have been consulted or informed around vaping education in their children's schools. Do we have any insight about what parental views are? Sarah, do you want to come in on that?
I think it's not necessarily that parents have been consulted. It's part of the PHSE curriculum now. It's part of what we're delivering in schools and schools are responding to. But I think there's certainly been a number of letters home to schools to keep them informed about the issue in schools because it's been so problematic. It's affecting every part of schools. And we've helped and just sending a letter out as of yesterday in terms of the current situation and really demonstrating again, one, getting people to respond to the national consultation as it is now, writing to their own MP about the situation, but also emphasising the resources that are available and support. So I think parents are getting that information out. It's how much that lands because it comes through either on phones and text messages or it's an email. So it's how much we can see how much of that is opened. But yeah, I think that varies across the country as well. And the other thing I would say in terms of our resources, we've done a huge amount of work to get them out through various different means in youth settings. But I do think it's really important to check that the right people have got them and go back and check with safeguarding leads and so on, because we know how busy schools are and heads and others.
Great, thanks. Jasmine, do you want to come in? Jasmine, do you want to come in on that as well?
Yeah, just anecdotally, I've been to a few schools recently delivering assemblies, and they have said that the parents have come to them rather than the other way around. The parents are coming saying, this is an issue. This is one of the biggest things that we think is impacting our children, and that it is not just within the school that they're accessing them at parties, and also we are getting kind of some information through parents as well. But in the future, I'm looking to do some more work with parents to specifically target what exactly their needs are and what they want to be educated on, because we do know that a lot of the time vapes can look quite different, and that means that parents aren't necessarily picking up that their children are vaping. So yeah, the parental education is going to be a really important way forward as well.
Great, thank you. That leads us on to a question: is there any data around the uptake of child vaping relatives to parent or family vaping? So if if your parents vape, are you more likely to vape?
Yeah, I can't think of any solid data on this, but we do know that parental smoking is a big risk factor for young people smoking. So I suspect there will be association. I guess the only thing to say is that a lot of the adults, the vast majority of adults who vape are ex-smokers, former smokers. So it would be likely that they would have been smoking and would have been influencing their young people to smoke. So some of these young people are ones that would have smoked instead.
Thank you. And I think sort of the questions are dropping off a little bit, because I have got one question around what work is going on in further education locations, and then we've had a comment around from Claire around supporting young people in hospitals. What's the risk of nicotine withdrawal, and is there a guidance from conversion to nicotine in terms of current nicotine replacement products? I can reread that, but first of all, it's around what work is happening in further education. Sarah, do you want to come in? Have you been doing any work in further education establishments?
So we've just, in terms of further education, we've just started that process with Sheffield College in terms of vaping in particular. And that really is about, as I said in my presentation, looking at the whole system. So looking at smoke free in terms of the college, it's looking at the needs of students. What came up particularly in further education, out of a group of 25 students, half of them were using illicit vapes. And I think that was the thing that was really concerning to me. So there's definitely a job of work to do there. I think the other thing is around displacement in terms of when we're implementing smoke-free policies and thinking about the risks in terms of roads, safeguarding, all of those factors. You've got a range of things that you need to take into account. I think the other thing I just wanted to say for us as well is there's a real range of things that we need to do with parents. We've got some parents that are actually giving young children vapes instead of sweets, which is in some of our more deprived areas. It certainly does make you do that, Anne. We've got an issue where then parents are going, well, they were going to smoke anyway, so they think they're doing the better thing. So it really needs to be handled really carefully, and that's more than likely being in situations where parents are vaping themselves and moving away from smoking. So there's a lot of learning that we need to do and getting underneath. And I'd go back to earlier, when a young person is vaping or smoking, we really need to understand why in order to address it effectively across the board and with schools. And the policies within schools, unfortunately for me in Sheffield, in some cases, kids are getting excluded from vaping. And I know that's also happening in other areas. And it's the tragedy that then ensues for that child and the impact. So we've got to address all of this.
Thank you very much. I just want to come back to Claire's question. I think it's an important one. Her question's around, so young people who are in hospital and have vaping but don't smoke tobacco, what's the guidelines for providing them with NRT products whilst in hospital? I guess I'll come to Louise for that one, and then I'll bring Sharon in.
Yes, and in a way, it also covers the question about what should be the school policy for children and young people who are using vapes for stopping smoking. I think you simply don't want young people vaping in a school for whatever reason. It sends out a very unhelpful message to others. So whether they're in hospital or they're during the school day, if a young person is experiencing nicotine withdrawal because they used to smoke, they should be using a nicotine replacement therapy product, which is discreet and is medicinal. What they do after the school day is a different matter, but in school, I think NRT products should be used.
Thank you. I've got two more questions. One is around what data do we have on youth vaping by gender and ethnicity? And then the second question is, how can we best collaborate across London to share and develop ideas around youth vaping as more research and data becomes available? So the first question is, what data do we have on vaping broken down by gender and ethnicity? And I don't know if you want to comment on that one.
Yes, so I think the smoking and drinking and drugs showed higher vaping among certainly the 15-year-old girls than boys. But I just can't, off the top of my head, remember what it is for the ASH data. So we can provide that later if no one else knows. In terms of ethnicity, the sample sizes are often too small to be able to examine this, unfortunately. We last looked at it around 2019. And what you tend to find in adults is that they're very similar to the higher, where you see higher smoking levels, you'll see the higher vaping levels. So for example, you get high smoking levels, for example, in Bangladeshi men. So you might expect the vaping levels to be higher there, although that's not always consistent. But I think for young people, we don't have the sample sizes, unfortunately, to be able to explore it in great depth.
Thanks. And Sarah, do you want to come in?
Just to say, Hull have done quite a large survey in schools with children and young people that does focus down on gender and ethnicity, so we could share that with people afterwards. But obviously that's just one place.
Great, thank you. I think Sharon's made a comment around whatever collaboration we do across London is that making sure that we include the informal youth sector and that important in reach to young people. I don't know if any of the panel any of the panel members have got any other comments that they want to say at this point, or any attendees have got any questions that they don't think we've answered. Oh, Louise, do you want to come in?
Just a bit of a plea. I'm getting a lot of anecdotes about children who are being punished in school for vaping, to the extent that they're being threatened with exclusion, and I would hope that this isn't a trend that develops, because as the point that's been made many times already today, is that a lot of these children, some of them will be doing it because they've got school anxiety. COVID has damaged their mental health, and that may be the one thing that's actually getting them back into school. So for schools not to take a punitive approach. And there was another point I was going to make, but I can't remember what it was now. So that's
thanks, Liz. And I think that's a really important point, because we spoke at one of the other webinars, didn't we, around so most young people don't vape, but those who do are more likely to take risk-taking behaviours, so therefore more likely to be vulnerable. And actually, school is the one place we definitely want to keep them engaged in. Sarah, do you want to come in?
It was just to also say we need to take into account academies within this, because often at a local level we can develop a policy, but it doesn't have to be adopted by that academy, because a lot of our secondary schools are academies. So we've gone down this route, and I'm not so sure whether it is a policy that we need anymore or whether it's a protocol. And because we don't want policies that sit on the shelves, what we want is, this is what action we would require you to take, and it takes a health, safeguarding and behaviour perspective, but put in health at the heart of it and safeguarding. So just the more I explore it locally, those are the stumbling blocks that people are coming across. So we can develop a policy, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't do that, but if the academy chooses not to use it, and they could be a school of academies, and that be across the country, not just in my area, and that then influences what will be taken on board. And unfortunately, Louise, I am hearing from a couple of my schools that they will exclude, and then you're stuck in terms of what you could do, other than creating good positive relationships and keeping the support available. But yeah, we definitely need to help each other on this nationally and locally.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Tracy's put in the chat something about creating, she thinks there's something that's coming out of these conversations about creating a vaping steering group or vaping board, bringing together professionals in research, youth and school sectors to discuss some of these important points, but also to keep on top of the research and evidence as more becomes available. So I think we'll probably be calling on many people on this call to join in. thank you so much for everybody, and to all our panel members and for our attendees. I think we'll start to wrap it up there, and you can have 3 minutes back before I'm sure you're all jumping on to your next meetings. And thank you to Tracy and Elliot who've pulled these webinars together. There's an awful lot of work that goes on behind the scenes. So I hope you have a lovely rest of your Tuesday, and thank you to all our speakers again.
Thank you, Kirsten.